folks, everybody sing. Now when the saints go marching in, there is a house in New Orleans. Pumped a lot of pain down in New Orleans.
We took a little bacon and we took a little beans and we caught the bloody British in a town in New Orleans.
Yes, I want to be in that number. When the saints go marching in.
Welcome back to the History of New Orleans. We last left off talking about the political, cultural, technological, and economic changes that New Orleans underwent after the end of Reconstruction. We didn't get to complete our discussion due to time constraints, so we will pick up where we left off with the New Orleans General Strike of 1892. To understand the context of the strike and to understand why it was the first major labor action in the city's history, we have to leave New Orleans for a little while. Up to this point in our story, we have seen New Orleans and the rest of America face many economic troubles. In fact, when researching the recessions and panics of the 19th century, there are more years with some sort of market contraction than there are without. Now, many of these were localized and short-lived, but there were a few, like the Panic of 1873 and the Long Depression, that were significantly destabilizing. All the while, though, America was transforming from a country of rural landowners and tenant farmers to a country of cities and industrial workers. When times are tough and you are a farmer, you really have only two choices: try and tough it out, or pack up and leave. Many farmers left and went west to try and find their fortunes. Others left and went to the cities or mines to turn their plow into a hammer or pickaxe. As more and more people concentrated into cities and found employment with large factory firms, they began recognizing that there was a divide within America. When times were tough and the smallholder farmer had to sell his family's land in order to survive, there were large landowners and real estate speculators who seemed impervious to the economic troubles and greedily gobbled up the available land. When the farmer arrived in the city, he found that these same men who had just bought his land owned the factories and the railroads, and well, let's face it, just about everything in sight. This class of capitalist nobility, lords and barons of the supposedly free and equal United States of America, were living in an entirely different world than the farmer and the worker, and it seemed as though this divide was not only arbitrary, but unfair. Why did those that toiled every day of their natural lives have to live in squalor and uncertainty, while a select few sat atop mountains of gold that they could never deplete in 1,000 lifetimes? By the 1890s, enough workers had opened their eyes to this injustice that they began organizing into a class that was politically aware enough to demand a better life. And what good is a demand if there is no threat of consequences if it is not met? So as America industrialized and as the country continued to feel the stress of the capitalist system, strikes became more and more common. At first, these strikes were spontaneous and disorganized, workers being paid an unsustainable pittance while working almost every waking hour simply broke under the pressure and refused to continue until some grievances were addressed. These strikes were great explosions of energy, but they could not accomplish very much because they lacked direction and endurance. The 1870s and 80s saw two massive strikes of railroad workers that crippled the economy, while the workers managed to hold out, but their most lasting effect was not a huge improvement in the livelihoods of railroad workers, but in convincing the political establishment that labor action had to be met with swift, merciless, and coordinated violence. The workers themselves learned that if they wanted to turn these sporadic spikes of energy into concrete movements, then they would have to be better organized. That is why, by the 1890s, membership in unions had risen rapidly throughout the country. In July of 1892, one of these unions, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, did not have their demands met by the absurdly powerful Carnegie Steel Company and called for a strike at the Homestead Steel Works in Pennsylvania. What followed was a 5-month face-off between striking workers and Carnegie thugs. In the end, 6,000 state militia marched into the town to force the workers back into the factory. It was a major loss for labor, as the union did not secure any increase in wages and saw public backlash decimate its membership. but it did serve as an example to other unions and other workers throughout the country that there was power in solidarity. The mere fact that the state had to intervene with an army showed that not only was the strike powerful, it was a real threat to the status quo. However, for a labor movement to succeed, they would not only need to know that they were strong, but that they could win. The overall defeat of the Homestead strike was not inspiring to the eventual outcomes of any other strike action, but luckily for the workers of New Orleans, there was an event earlier in 1892 that did ignite hope and victory. In May, in one of New Orleans' iconic industries, the streetcars, conductors walked out in order to win a 10-hour workday and guaranteed recognition of their union. After a short dispute with the bosses, the conductors returned to work, having achieved both of their goals. This set the stage for the pivotal year that New Orleans labor was about to have. The victory served as a major boost to the local perception of unionization, and by the end of June, there were 49 new unions representing a wide range of occupations in New Orleans that registered with the American Federation of Labor. Now, the strength of a union comes from individual workers banding together to stand for their collective betterment, so it only made logical sense that each individual union could be further strengthened by banding together with other unions. To this end, the major unions of New Orleans came together towards the end of the summer to form the Working Men's Amalgamated Council, a non-governmental organization dedicated purely to the solidarity of New Orleans' working class. Within the Working Men's Amalgamated Council, there was an exceptionally powerful alliance of 3 unions that held a huge amount of leverage over the city. This was the Triple Alliance of the Teamsters, the Scalesmen, and the Packers. Recall that New Orleans was not as industrialized as other cities of comparable size, and therefore most of its workforce was employed in the transportation and trade business. Scalesmen were responsible for weighing and assessing goods traveling to and from the docks and train yards of New Orleans. Packers were in charge of loading and unloading goods from trains and ships. The Teamsters were movers. They carried packages by hand, carriage, wagon, you name it. Without all 3 of these unions working, there would be no trade in New Orleans and the economy would collapse like a cheap tent. Beyond just how important the Triple Alliance was to the functioning of New Orleans' economy, they were also a unique example of racial cooperation in the Crescent City. While other professions could afford to discriminate, the importance of the Triple Alliance jobs and the demand for a large number of workers meant that all 3 of these unions were integrated. The Packers and Scalesmen's jobs were considered to require more skilled workers, and thus the management made a concerted effort to exclude as many black men as they could, since they thought of them as intellectually inferior. As a consequence, these 2 unions had a higher percentage of white men within their ranks, but the workers recognized the skill and hard work of the black Teamsters, and so solidarity was able to grow. In a post-Reconstruction city in the South, it was rare to see white people interacting with black people in a harmonious sense. Even in New Orleans, who we have remarked had its own special relationships between the races, we almost never saw this level of respect between groups that the political elite would have preferred to stay separate. So not only did the Triple Alliance threaten the economic status quo, they also threatened the racial status quo. Then, in October, to the horror of the Democrats, both Ring and Reform, the Triple Alliance flexed their strength. On the 24th, up to 3,000 black and white workers walked out of the docks and the train yards in order to achieve what the streetcar conductors had achieved 5 months earlier, and what the Homestead steelworkers would fail to achieve 1 month later. The alliance was optimistic, though, enough that they added to their demands of a 10-hour workday in recognition of the union, the demand for overtime pay. The forces arrayed against the alliance coalesced into the New Orleans Board of Trade. The board represented bosses and owners from many prominent businesses in the city, including its 4 big ones: cotton, sugar, rice, and the railroads. It was the board's job to raise the funds necessary to hire scabs to replace the striking workers, and if necessary, hire Pinkerton thugs to assault the picket lines so that the scabs could get to work. The board also took steps to divide the alliance by pitting the 2 predominantly white unions against the black Teamsters. They refused to negotiate with all 3 at the same time, but they said they would negotiate with the Scalesmen and Packers. It was an enticing offer, especially to many white workers who had grown up in New Orleans, and so segregation and racism was just the norm for them. The fires of anti-black sentiment were stoked by the local media, including the New Orleans Bee and the Picayune. These rags printed endless stories about roving mobs of black workers assaulting anyone they came across, whether they were a scab or not. But there were enlightened members of the two unions who fought back against this narrative. They stressed the class ties that the white and black workers held, and argued that it was the bosses who were the real enemy. During this period in history, and in this place, we could expect that these enlightened voices would be a minority, that they would be drowned out by the whirlwind of racial animosity that was baked into Southern society. However, this time, the bonds of class would hold firm, and the scalesmen and packers voted to remain faithful to their teamster brothers, refusing to negotiate without them. The bosses hadn't really been willing to negotiate with the white unions, and when the Triple Alliance held firm, the board used their stubborn will as an excuse to outright reject all their terms. With no diplomatic way forward, the strikers knew that all they had to do was hold out until the economic damage was enough to force the bosses back to the negotiating table. The board also believed that all they had to do was hold out until the starving workers begged to have their jobs back, so they could feed their families. This is where the importance of the Workingmen's Amalgamated Council really came into play. Sympathetic laborers who were not on strike were able to support the families of their comrades in the Triple Alliance and extended the strike indefinitely. Still, the purpose of a strike is not to destroy the economy. The purpose is to win a favorable contract where workers would be treated with dignity, and so the Council and the Triple Alliance looked for a way to bring a swift end to the strike. They settled on expanding the strike to the rest of the city, and talks of organizing the first general strike in New Orleans history began in the first week of November. Support among the membership of the various unions of the Council for the general strike was near unanimous, and they formed a committee of 5 unions who would represent all the rest in negotiations. The date of the general offensive against the forces of capital was set for November 8th. On that day, over 30,000 workers walked out of their jobs. This represented over half of New Orleans' total workforce. Every industry from cotton to hotels and every type of worker from printers to musicians participated. Black and white, Creole, Irish, German, Italian, Chinese, all races, all ethnicities came together to demand rights not only for themselves but for each other. It was truly momentous, and it truly terrified the political establishment. The board tried to undercut the general strike by offering higher wages to anyone willing to cross the picket line. Only 59 men in New Orleans scabbed. Then the board tried to go out of state, calling upon workers from Memphis, Birmingham, and Galveston to come to New Orleans to break the strike. These men also refused. As a final resort, they offered to pay the state militia to come work the jobs left vacant by the strikers. The militia came, but the strikers refused to let them cross the picket line, or if they managed to, they found that they could not perform the work on account of interference from the strikers. Before the general strike, the Triple Alliance had slowed the economy of New Orleans to a crawl for 2 weeks. The general strike brought it to a screeching halt for 3 days. When the state militia arrived in New Orleans on November 10th, they had expected to find riotous workers and those roving bands of black men that the press kept warning people about. Instead, they found a city that was quiet as the grave. No streetcars ran, no vendors sold their wares, it was absolute silence. It only took 3 days for the board to lose their nerve, and on November 11th, they agreed to come back to the negotiating table as long as everyone returned to work. Not wanting to hurt the city, the strikers accepted these terms and work resumed on the 12th. After 2 days of negotiation, the board, the Triple Alliance, and the Committee of 5 settled on the terms of a 10-hour workday and overtime pay. Importantly, though, the board managed to escape the ordeal without having to formally recognize the legitimacy of any of the unions, and did not commit to the union shop proposal that would have made it illegal to hire non-union workers. This severely hampered any future attempts at labor action. In the short term, the New Orleans general strike was absolutely a victory for labor in the Crescent City. The improvement to quality of life for those workers who secured the 10-hour day and overtime was tremendous. It also inspired hope for the people in the city and around the country for the prospect of healing the racial divide that scarred America. Through class solidarity, the workers of New Orleans had proved that white men and black men held some common causes, and if these causes were championed, then maybe, just maybe, America could truly become a free and equal society. Unfortunately, the general strike was also a wake-up call to the forces of reaction and despotism. Never again could they allow such a broad base of support to exist for the toiling, disenfranchised masses. To this end, the media, politicians, and business owners ratcheted up the racist agitative propaganda to 11. The beautiful United Workingmen's Alliance in 1892 would be followed in 1895 by a horrible incident when the New Orleans docks tried to undercut unionized white workers by hiring non-union black men. Instead of banding together with their fellow laborers and taking the fight to their bosses like they had in 1892, the white workers formed an armed mob to intimidate the black men off the docks. This eventually resulted in the mob shooting and killing 6 black dock workers and effectively ending racial cooperation in New Orleans' workforce. But even if the victory of 1892 was not the final victory, or the first victory in an unbroken chain leading to the emancipation of the worker and people of color, it was an important victory nevertheless. The scenes of white and black cooperation among the unions was so inspiring that even outside the world of class conflict, New Orleans became ground zero for white and black Creoles, bringing an important civil case to the courts that you might have heard of. In 1890, the Democrat-dominated state legislature passed a whole slew of bills focused on the separation of the races. One in particular was the Separate Car Act that established separate seating sections for each race and prohibited either black people from sitting in the white sections or white people sitting in the black sections. The penalty for disobeying the law wasn't exactly draconian, either a $25 fine or 20 days in prison, but the mere fact that it reinforced the belief that black people were somehow essentially different from white people was a huge insult to humanity. 2 years after the bill was passed and implemented, the people of New Orleans finally decided to fight it. It was within the Creole community, which still held a good deal of power in the city, that there formed a Comité Citoyen, or Committee of Citizens. This committee was mixed along racial lines, although they kept within their ethnic enclave. Creoles of color and white Creoles came together just like white unions and black unions did and worked for the common cause of justice. The Committee of Citizens' goal was to sue the state over a case where a black man had been arrested and charged for sitting in a white compartment. The easiest and safest way to do this was to stage an incident where they controlled both the man being arrested and the man arresting him. To achieve this, they nominated Homer Plessy, a Creole of color, to ride in the train from New Orleans to Covington, Louisiana, while sitting in the white compartment. They also hired a private investigator who had a license from the state to perform arrests to detain Plessy. The train company was also in on the plan. It wasn't that the train companies had a vested interest in the civil rights movement, but rather that they hated the new law because it forced them to buy twice as many passenger compartments for their trains, and thus ate into their profits. Now, an important fact about Homer Plessy was that he was what the genealogists of the day called an octoroon. This meant that his parents were white, and all 4 of his grandparents were white, and all but one of his great-grandparents were white. However, that one black great-grandparent was enough to qualify him under the law as black. His appearance was, to the casual observer, pretty much identical to that of any white man. It was the hope of the Committee of Citizens that using Mr. Plessy as the face for their case would garner sympathy with the white judge and highlight the absurdity of a law which discriminated upon appearance, even for people who no one could tell was of one group without consulting a genealogical history. There was also anxiety within the committee that if the case went their way, there would be a violent reaction from white supremacist groups, but that they would be less likely to lash out at the extremely fair-skinned Mr. Plessy. In fact, Mr. Plessy was so fair-skinned that it is likely that without informing the train company and the private investigator of his intention to break the law, he would have never been questioned for sitting in the white compartment. As it was, on June 7, 1892, Homer Plessy was arrested after refusing to vacate the white section of a Louisiana train, and the trial began. Plessy's case rested on the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution that established that all people born within the borders of the United States were citizens, and that states could not pass or enforce laws that deprived its citizens from life, liberty, or property. Plessy argued that his freedom to choose where he sat on a train as a person who paid for a ticket was violated by the Separate Car Act. The first man to preside over this case was District Court Judge John Howard Ferguson. He rejected Plessy's claim that the Separate Car Act was unlawful and pushed the case to a criminal trial. Plessy's attorneys then petitioned the Louisiana Supreme Court to delay the criminal trial until they could review Judge Ferguson's decision. They agreed, but in December of 1892, they upheld Ferguson's ruling on the basis of two precedents. One was tied to the Massachusetts Supreme Court that had ruled separate schooling legal and stated that racial prejudice was not created by law and so it could not be repealed by law. The other was tied to a Pennsylvania law that also segregated train cars and which stated that it was natural for black and white people to be separated and so states should pass laws to keep this separation. The Committee of Citizens was not about to just give up, though. 4 years after the inciting incident, the United States Supreme Court heard the case of Plessy v. Ferguson. It is important to note that when this whole crusade started back in the summer of 1892, the eventual goal was to have the case tried in the Supreme Court, so that its precedent might repeal all segregation laws in every state. But since then, a couple of key judges left the Supreme Court and were replaced by reactionary-leaning conservatives. Now there was a worry that the court would uphold Ferguson's decision, and segregation would be entrenched rather than abolished. Nevertheless, the committee's lawyers did their best to present their argument to the court. They were opposed by Attorney General Milton Cunningham of New Orleans, who was such a radical white supremacist that during Reconstruction he had been arrested as a party to a white supremacist plot to harass black people in Louisiana. In the end, the hill was too steep to climb for the committee, and the court ruled 7-1 to uphold the Separate Car Act and condemned the country to 60 more years of legal segregation under the basis of separate but equal. Ironically, the judge who wrote the majority opinion was named Henry Brown. It would be another Brown in 1954, sitting on the opposite side of the bench and representing civil rights rather than white supremacy, that would finally avenge Homer Plessy when segregation was overturned in Brown v. Board of Education. But before that happened, black Americans would have to endure the indignity of unequal treatment under the laws of a country that they were citizens of. As for Homer Plessy, he returned to New Orleans, where he pleaded guilty to violating the now thoroughly entrenched Separate Car Act and chose to pay the $25 fine. The defeat of the Committee of Citizens was much more resounding and much more consequential than the results of the 1892 general strike, but both serve as landmark events in race relations in New Orleans. The very fact that white Creoles and black Creoles came together just like the working class to fight for a brighter future for all New Orleanians showed that there was hope for the city to overcome its racial animosity. White supremacy in New Orleans was like the levees, holding back the Mississippi River. It was strong, seemingly impenetrable. It withstood assault after assault from the forces of justice. But eventually the waters of liberty overcame them and flooded the city, washing away its sins. There is still more work to do, but Homer Plessy and the Triple Alliance were the first drops of a torrent that will inevitably cleanse the Crescent City. As we can see, 1892 was a busy year for New Orleans. Aside from labor actions and the Plessy v. Ferguson case, it was also an election year. In fact, it was a very busy election year, with people going to the polls to elect municipal officials, including the mayor, state officials, including the governor, and federal officials, including the president. It was a Democrat victory down the line, with Grover Cleveland comfortably winning the presidency, Murphy Foster winning Louisiana's governorship in yet another election that was really just a contest between the Democrats, and John Fitzpatrick winning the mayorship of New Orleans, who was the nominee from the anti-Murphy Foster faction of the New Orleans Democratic Party. Fitzpatrick was also a career politician of the ring, but this year people really voted along the line of pro-lottery or anti-lottery. The lottery issue was more of a state issue than a city issue, but it did have a noticeable effect on New Orleans during this time period. There had been lotteries in New Orleans dating back to before the Louisiana Purchase, but the one that really gained infamy and had everyone's attention in 1892 was founded back during Reconstruction in 1868. In its original form, the lottery was a way for private businessmen to effectively fleece the population of Louisiana under the guise of an officially sanctioned gambling ring. The state itself took an annual $40,000 cut from this scheme. Over the years, the revenue gained from the lottery grew exponentially, but this did not come without its own problems. The lottery had always been controversial, in no small part because the act that legalized it also banned other types of gambling in the state to give the lottery a complete monopoly. The opposition to the lottery grew in tandem with its success, so that the men who profited from it were forced to dump larger and larger sums of money into lobbying the government to keep their charter. In 1890, the lottery company upped its annual payments to $500,000, and in recognition of this generous donation, the legislature wrote into the new state constitution that the lottery was an integral part of the state's financial system, and so to get rid of it, they would need a 2/3 majority in both the state Senate and the state House of Representatives to repeal the lottery. For many who were ambivalent to the lottery, this was a step too far, and a truly massive number of Louisianians made it their most important issue of the 1892 elections. However, the lottery wasn't just a moral issue. While the pro-lottery faction did make the argument that the lottery was only taking money from willing participants, and so it was not immoral, the real basis of their support came from the fact that the lottery lobby had contributed so much money to election campaigns and the financing of public improvements that, should it be abolished, there would be a significant reduction in the liquidity of the Democratic Party. The lottery was effectively a tax, and while it was corrupt, it also provided funding for many important ventures in New Orleans. But the good it did was outweighed by its corruption and its image as a promotion of immoral behavior, although there were plenty of other institutions in New Orleans that were just as immoral. In the end, the lottery was killed by a double blow. In 1890, in response to the entrenchment of the lottery in the state constitution, the federal government took action against all lotteries in the United States. The Senate passed a bill which banned the advertisement of lotteries through letters, newspapers, and circulars. While this did not outlaw the lottery outright, it severely curbed its ability to reach the general population, which it relied on to fund it. Then, in 1892, the anti-lottery Murphy ticket won the gubernatorial election in Louisiana and made it their mission to sweep aside the remnants of the lottery. It would manage to limp along until 1907, but after the election of Murphy, it was no longer the political behemoth it had once been. The loss of the revenue from the lottery did not seem to have the extreme adverse effects that its supporters assumed it would. It actually seemed to do the opposite, as the duration of Mayor Fitzpatrick's term from 1892 to 1896 saw the finances of New Orleans improve despite the loss of the lottery, despite the increase in spending on public improvements, and despite the rest of the country experiencing economic uncertainty with the panics of 1893 and 94. One of his major improvements was a complete rehaul of the city's drainage system. Along with all the other challenges of modernizing that other cities had to contend with, New Orleans was uniquely susceptible to drainage problems. Throughout the city's history, it has had problems with water. Apart from hurricanes and flash floods, even a year of mild weather regularly saw the streets inundated with stagnant pools of dirty water that bred disease and foul smells. Lest we forget that New Orleans is essentially built in a swamp. So it has been the headache of every government since 1718 to find an efficient way at keeping the city dry and clean. The Fitzpatrick administration put more time and energy into this project than any had before, but even they could not complete it as debate over funding methods stalled the project in committee until it had to be finished by the next administration. Still, Fitzpatrick laid the important groundwork for a drainage system that would, along with other improvements, end the plague of yellow fever in New Orleans within the next decade. The other improvement projects started by Fitzpatrick would be completed, or at least nearly completed, during his 4 years in office. Among these were the building of new docks at the head of Louisiana Avenue to facilitate the ever-growing trade industry, the merging of the Fisk-Free and public libraries into the city library, and the electrification of the streetcars in New Orleans. Although we must remember that these electric streetcars would be segregated due to the unfortunate outcome of Plessy v. Ferguson. The Fitzpatrick administration also made changes to the practice of disposing of the city's trash. Previously, it had all been collected in carts and then dumped into the Mississippi River, making that waterway a stinking, polluted eyesore. Now, in line with more modern practices, the garbage of New Orleans would be shipped off to a special plant to be burned. This change also meant that residents would have to sort their trash so that certain dangerous or inflammable materials would not be mixed in with the rest. This little inconvenience was enough to turn the populace against the whole idea, and many kept dumping their garbage into the river against policy. The garbage scandal and other fiascos related to Fitzpatrick's undying loyalty to his corrupt partners in the ring put a blemish on his otherwise objectively successful term. There was even an attempt to impeach him on the grounds of his special relationship with a plumbing business in New Orleans that he was allegedly awarding generous city contracts to. The judge in charge of the impeachment case eventually acquitted Fitzpatrick of all charges, but the mere existence of the case shows that there were those within the government, as well as the general population, that saw Fitzpatrick as just another cog in the governmental patronage machine. That's probably why the campaign season of 1896, the last of the 19th century, included yet another reform splinter of the Democratic Party to contest Fitzpatrick in the ring. Now this time, the reformers, who gathered under the banner of the Citizens League, did not officially tie themselves to the Democratic Party, but many of their leaders were former Democrats, and they mostly kept in line with the party's goals. Mostly, they just ran on a platform of cleaning out corruption, without shaking the status quo too much. Their big rallying cry was, "As death destroys citizenship, dead man shall no longer be permitted to exercise the right of suffrage." This may seem like a pretty common sense position, but as we have seen for the last 12 years of New Orleans' history, voter fraud, and specifically using the names of deceased men to stuff the ballots, was a favorite tactic of the ring. While the old battle between reform and ring was just another turn in the cycle of New Orleans' politics, the election of 1896 also brought some new flavor to the arena. Up until this point, the working class of New Orleans had mostly been ignored by politics. For the first few decades of democracy in the city, they hadn't even been able to vote due to restrictive property laws granting the franchise only to wealthy white men. Even after the franchise was extended to any white man 21 years or older, and then eventually to black men for a brief time, the working classes did not vote as a class. They mostly followed the suit of their wealthier peers, voting along ethnic and religious lines, without paying much thought as to whether the politicians they supported really represented their interests. But now, as class consciousness was rising, as evident by the general strike of 1892, the working classes began to assert themselves and demand representation. At first, the powerful men of New Orleans greeted the laborers with patronizing condescension, since they still believed that the uneducated and unwashed masses could not think critically for themselves, and so leadership should be left to those with the proper pedigree. But once the working class showed that they did have the intelligence and the power to organize effective resistance to the status quo, this condescending attitude turned more into fear. Fear that the sheer numbers of workers would overwhelm the forces of capital and turn the subjugators into the subjugated. In order to forestall this outcome, the Ring and the Reformers sought to co-opt the working class movement so that they could manipulate it to their own purposes. This was probably why Fitzpatrick was nominated and then elected in 1892, because he had a reputation as a friend of the working classes when he really was a stooge to the Ring, making him the perfect controlled opposition. Likewise, in 1896, the Citizens League had a counterpart called the Citizens Party. Unlike the League, the party was made up of representatives from the working majority of New Orleans, and while they mostly copied the rhetoric and politics of the League, their class makeup was enough to worry the establishment. However, there was a simple fix for the establishment to mitigate this threat. They controlled the Board of Registration, whose prerogative it was to choose which parties could be represented on the ballots. At first, they wanted to stop both the League and the party from being available to the voters, but in the end they made the pragmatic decision to allow the League ticket to stand for election to give the appearance of fairness while still sidestepping the working class threat. The Citizens Party, effectively barred from standing for election, chose to merge with the Citizens League. In order to placate their new allies, the League adopted a lot of pro-labor rhetoric without making any changes to its leadership structure. Their nomination for mayor was Walter Flower, a wealthy businessman and participant in the White League insurrection of 1874. The Ring attacked Flower in the press for his affluent background and his questionable loyalty to the Democratic Party, as he had very briefly joined the Republicans when they promised to protect his sugar business with tariffs. It seems, though, that Flower's participation in the White League insurrection dispelled any notion that he was for civil rights, and so his reputation remained untarnished within the eyes of the white electorate. The Ring, on the other hand, was finding it difficult to find a candidate that was likewise untarnished. The nature of the corrupt political body was that offices would be handed out based on seniority and service to the party, but all their top men, including incumbent Mayor Fitzpatrick, had been under indictment in the last 4 years and so carried with them too much political baggage to effectively contest the election. Eventually, the Ring managed to coax Congressman Charles Buck into abandoning his national political career to come save them from defeat in New Orleans. Mr. Buck was a good candidate, and probably the best the Ring could hope for, but his popularity in New Orleans was not enough to hide the fact that the rest of his ticket was staffed entirely by party goons and disreputable parasites. If New Orleans voted down the Buck ballot, they would be saddled with essentially the same government that they currently had and despised. Because of this, Buck was doomed, and Flower won with a comfortable margin, as did the rest of his ticket. The election of 1896 was a great victory for anti-Ring politics in New Orleans, but it would be the last time, except for a brief intermission from 1920 to 1925, that any party would be able to defeat the Ring for nearly 50 years. When looking at the accomplishments of Mayor Flower in a vacuum, it could be argued that he was one of the most successful and beneficial administrators New Orleans ever had. A caveat has to be made, however, that Flower was lucky enough to serve during a period when a lot of long-term and consequential projects were being completed. We have to laud him for carrying the torch across the finish line, but most of his achievements were started by previous administrations. As Flower closed out the 19th century New Orleans, he oversaw the implementation of a new city charter, the finishing of the extensive drainage system developed under Fitzpatrick, the transfer of the city's water supply from the hands of a private corporation into the hands of the public, reforms to the police department, laying of electrical wire beneath the city, the list goes on and on. The end of the 19th century also saw changes to voting rights, some good and some bad. In the aforementioned transfer of New Orleans' water supply from a negligent private corporation to the municipal government, women of the city who owned property were allowed to vote in a public referendum on the proposed new ordinance for the first time. Although it wouldn't be until the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified in 1920 that they would be able to vote in elections. On the bad side of things, the Constitutional Convention of 1898 in Louisiana instituted literacy laws, ostensibly to make sure the electorate was educated enough to make informed decisions on political issues, when in reality these laws combined with the systemic underfunding of the black side of the segregated school system to disenfranchise many black voters. A person's level of education should not determine their unalienable right to vote, especially when a particular group of people are purposefully restricted in their opportunity for an education. If you don't believe that education was skewed along demographic lines, keep in mind that in 1899, of the 23,668 children enrolled in New Orleans' school system, 20,257 of them were white. The Flower administration represents a clear transition point in New Orleans history, and not just from the 19th century to the 20th century. Those who characterized the Reconstruction era as a time of endless strife and political violence saw the peaceful election of Flower as the end of that era. Though we know from our research that political violence was present in New Orleans long before Reconstruction, and that the period really ended when white supremacy returned to power in the South after 1877. Nevertheless, the divisiveness and anxiety that was carried over into the post-Reconstruction period seems to have cooled to a manageable temperature by the time Flower took office. The turn of the century offered the citizens of the Crescent City hope that there were better days ahead, and although the road would be long and fraught with danger, they would eventually be right. In the immediate term, the Gilded Age, as the post-Reconstruction period is often called, brought back economic stability and growth to New Orleans. The city would never again experience the explosive rise to prominence it had during the first few decades of the 19th century, but it no longer seemed to be on the verge of collapse. The early 1900s were a much more modest affair in the realm of politics as well. Aside from the lack of bloodshed at the polls, the pattern of reform movements opposing the Ring gradually lost energy as the party machinery co-opted some of the reform positions in order to entice their voter base back into the fold. While many municipal elections would see some contest, it was almost a foregone conclusion that the Ring would win, but that the reformers would see some of their supported policies enacted. Now, seeing as most of our last few episodes have been centered around the local politics of New Orleans, you might expect us to run out of things to talk about as they settle down. You would be wrong to assume that, though, since there are always exciting things happening in the Crescent City. For one, 1901 saw President William McKinley visit New Orleans, making him the first president to visit the city while in office. The visit was part of McKinley's transcontinental tour, which was made possible with the complete interconnection of America's great cities via the railroads. While in New Orleans, McKinley visited the Cabildo and met with a delegation of students from Southern University, the first university in New Orleans to accept black students. Despite this gesture of racial reconciliation, McKinley's laissez-faire attitude towards the problem of racism in America later led to his alienation among black voters who had previously supported him. McKinley wasn't in New Orleans to fix race relations, though. He was there to promote his foreign policy, particularly the part that pertained to an open trade deal with China. Since New Orleans was such a major trade hub, he wanted to make sure the merchants in the city understood just how important the lands of the Far East would be to the economic future of America. This point would have been more relevant had New Orleans been a direct trader with China, but since the Panama Canal wouldn't be constructed until 13 years after McKinley's visit, any ships traveling from China to New Orleans had to go all the way around South America and back up north to the Gulf of Mexico. Still, I'm sure McKinley knew this and was more interested in just laying the groundwork for any future relationship the city might have with China, aside from the Chinese workers who we have already discussed arrived in the city over the last few decades. It may have served New Orleans better if McKinley had made an effort to massage the racial tensions in the city. As we have discussed before and will continue to discuss for the remainder of this podcast, there was a constant struggle between the black population and the white population in New Orleans. A year before McKinley came to the city, this struggle saw one of its most horrific incidents, which served as a reminder that freedom was something that had to constantly be fought for. To set the scene for this terrible event, we must consider the expansion of Jim Crow leading up to the 20th century. The Louisiana State Constitution of 1898 severely limited the franchise in the state by enacting strict voter registration, poll taxes, literacy tests, and a slew of other regulations that were rarely ever used in refusing white people the right to vote, but were universally used to take that right away from black people. Once political power was outside the realm of possibility for black Louisianians, the Democrats passed 8 more Jim Crow laws to segregate the races. This was the case throughout the South, and many black people were forced to consider leaving their homes for fear of slipping back into slavery or being a victim of white supremacist violence. Many went north to opportunities in the rapidly expanding urban centers of Chicago, Detroit, and New York. There was also a section of the black community who believed that white people and black people would never reach mutual understanding because there was just too much painful history between the two. These people were supporters of the Liberia movement, or the return to Africa. In 1820, the first ship carrying free black settlers left New York to find land in West Africa that they could take. Over the next few decades, many more would follow them until there were enough in 1847 for the country of Liberia to declare its independence from America. Since then, many civil rights groups and black revolutionaries have endorsed the idea of a homeland for black Americans in Africa. One of these supporters was Robert Charles, who came to New Orleans in 1900 to drum up support for Liberia and to promote a culture of self-defense within the black community. Now, when any oppressive system sees its victims gathering their strength together to either resist or escape it, It reacts with disproportionate force. First, the police carried out an unlawful search of Mr. Charles's personal domicile under the suspicion that he had fled from his home in Mississippi to New Orleans after committing some sort of crime. The vagueness of this accusation sheds doubt on whether or not the police fabricated this story. Whatever the case, when the cops searched Charles's home, they found pamphlets and literature that sought to educate the black community in New Orleans on their right to self-defense in the face of white supremacy. Obviously, the cops and the white elite believed that this kind of language only agitated the people of color, who were supposedly content with their situation in New Orleans and were not victims of oppression. The educational literature was not enough for the police to arrest Charles, but from now on they would keep a close eye on him, and if any chance arose for them to grab him, they would. That chance came on the night of July 23, 1900. Charles had been boarding with his cousin, Leonard Pierce, in a house on Washington Avenue and Dryades Street, in an area that was predominantly white. On this particular night, the white folks came suspicious of Charles and Pierce, who were sitting peacefully on a porch waiting for a friend. 3 policemen were sent to respond to a call made by one of these white folks, and when they arrived at the porch, they began questioning Charles and Pierce. Then, without warning, one of the officers, a man named Moira, tried to grab Charles. Charles drew a gun to defend himself, and the 2 men ended up wounding each other in their legs. Charles fled, and Pierce was detained by the other 2 officers. Charles made it back to his residence and barricaded himself in for the night. In the early morning hours of July 24th, Police Captain Day and a patrol wagon full of officers arrived at Charles's place to take him or kill him. Rather than go quietly and await what was surely going to be a painful interrogation and then likely an execution, Charles stood his ground with a Winchester rifle. His self-defense training must have been quite excellent, as he was able to nail Captain Day in the heart and another officer in the head, killing both, which allowed him to make his escape. News spread quickly of the fatal shooting of 2 policemen, and soon there was a lynch mob gathered on 4th Street. Before this mob could do any damage, however, someone spread a false rumor that Charles had already been caught by the authorities, and the mob dispersed. This would only be a temporary reprieve, and eventually the part of the white population of New Orleans that was eager for racial violence would again form a dangerous mob. The next day, on July 25th, the city officials tried to prevent this from happening by offering a $250 reward for the safe arrest of Charles and urged all citizens to remain calm. The press, on the other hand, printed wildly fictitious stories about a black conspiracy that spread throughout the city, which was connected to Charles and the killing of the 2 officers. The lynch mobs heeded the word of the papers rather than the government, and on the night of the 25th, they killed 3 innocent black men and hospitalized 6 more. There were pockets of less extreme violence throughout New Orleans that night, and in the end, more than 50 people reported injuries related to what can only be characterized as race riots. As the city convulsed with such riots for 2 more days, Charles was hunkered down in a boarding house on Saratoga Street. On the 27th of July, he was found by the police, and the house was surrounded by a patchwork army of police, state militia, and vigilante citizens. In the final assault, Charles once again showed his skill with a rifle, managing to kill 5 of his assailants before finally the house was set on fire, which drove him out. Charles was summarily executed by a police volunteer, and then his body was beaten and shot hundreds of times by enraged white supremacists. The end of Charles was not the end of the race riots, however. The evening after he was killed, mobs of white supremacists burned down 2 black schools and murdered at least 3 more black people. Dozens more were injured. By the time things finally settled back down on the 28th of July, 28 people had been killed. 7 of these were policemen shot by Charles. The majority of the rest were innocent black people. Over 60 people, again a majority of whom were black, sustained injuries varying from mild to severe. The Robert Charles riots, as they are called, was a sobering reminder to everyone in New Orleans just how terrible the race relations in the city were. Before Charles came to town, the white population had deluded themselves into thinking that the racial hierarchy was the natural order of things, that whites deserved to have power, and that black people were happy to fill a servile position in society. Now they saw that not only were black people unhappy with their prescribed role, They were willing to fight to the death to free themselves from white supremacy. For a lot of the black population, however, violence and revolution were not desirable. Those that did want to fight white supremacy, peaceful solutions through the system was the obvious way to achieve racial equality with the least amount of bloodshed. But as we saw with the failure of Plessy v. Ferguson, the system wasn't about to bend to the will of an oppressed minority. There were also black people who were not happy with their lot in life, but were too afraid of retribution if they spoke out against the established order. These people just kept their heads down and hoped that eventually things would get better. The race riots of 1900, however, proved that even black people who were not connected to movements opposing white supremacy, be they peaceful or revolutionary, could still become victims of its battles. New Orleans may have been heading into the 20th century prospering economically, but many of the social issues that had plagued it during the 19th century would continue to be a problem for many generations of New Orleanians. Aside from racial tensions, there was also a continuation of class struggle in the Crescent City. While nothing near the scale of the general strike occurred in the first few years of the 20th century, there were constant clashes between the workers of New Orleans and their bosses. One of the most serious of these conflicts was between the streetcar workers and the company that had recently acquired the rights to all the electrical lines in the city. The streetcars were the circulatory system of the city, and so if they didn't run, everything from shipping to restaurants were affected. These were the days before cars were anything but a rare commodity, and many people relied on the streetcars to get from their homes to work. Despite the high demand for the streetcars, the men who operated them were constantly belittled, underpaid, and overworked by their employers. Therefore, there was an almost annual occurrence of some sort of strike or threat of one. Remember, the wave of labor unrest in 1892 was started by a streetcar strike, and ever since then the conductors and the linemen stayed stalwart in their fight for a decent life. In October of 1900, there was a short strike on one of the streetcar lines that only lasted 2 days. In response to this minor action, the company negotiated a deal which guaranteed employment and hours to its conductors. This deal was mutually accepted by both, the bosses and the workers, and so peace between the sides was achieved, for about a month. Then the company upgraded all their lines with new, larger streetcars, which cut down the demand for conductors. Some were laid off and others had their hours slashed. Tensions once again began rising, but they wouldn't manifest as any action until September of 1901. After a mass meeting on September 24th, the workers came forward with the demands of an 8-hour workday and a minimum wage of 25 cents per hour. The shorter workday would force the company to hire the men it had previously fired, or give out more shifts to the men they already had. The company categorically refused the demands on the grounds that they were superseded by the agreement made in April of the last year. This agreement had already been broken by the bosses laying off men, and so the workers resolved to enforce their demands with a strike. On the morning of the 27th of September, every single streetcar line in New Orleans stopped dead. Despite the fact that the shutdown of the streetcars made life more difficult for almost everyone in New Orleans, the general public attitude was that the workers were in the right. Other unions, in the spirit of 1892, endorsed the strike, but did not join it. The linemen, those workers who maintained the electrical lines that powered the streetcars, did join in a sort of hybrid strike. The company that owned the streetcars also happened to control the electric street lighting in New Orleans. The linemen refused to work for the streetcar side of the business, but they still maintained the lights in the cities during the strike. For the first few weeks, the strikes were peaceful. Then on October 8th, the company brought in strike breakers, and the city government lent them police as protection. When the scabs tried to operate the streetcars, they were set upon by the strikers. There were some minor injuries, and the scabs were forced to retreat, but they would soon be back with even more police. On October 9th, the governor of Louisiana heeded the wishes of the mayor of New Orleans and called out the state militia to protect the strikebreakers. The swift escalation by the government shows just how afraid they were of the streetcar strike spreading into another general strike. With the increased number of armed men on the side of Capitol, the governor found now a good time to issue an ultimatum. He kept his demand reasonable, knowing that if he pushed too hard, there would be serious repercussions. He told the strikers on October 10th that they would be paid 20 cents per hour for 10-hour shifts if they ended the strike immediately and came back to work. While this deal was less than what they initially wanted, it had been more than 2 weeks since the streetcar conductors had had work, and they could not afford to hold out much longer. This, along with the probability that any further resistance would be met with overwhelming force from the several hundred state militiamen posted in New Orleans, meant that they had no choice but to accept the deal as it was offered and end the strike. Even though the conductors did not get exactly what they wanted, the strike was still seen as a victory. Again, they had used the power of collective action to force their bosses to bend to them, and had achieved some gains towards improving their livelihoods. Was this enough to quiet the rumblings of the toiling masses in New Orleans? Well, to answer that, we can just look at the municipal elections of 1904. One thing of note in these elections was that they were the first to take place under a poll tax instituted at the state level. This tax, intended to disenfranchise poor black people, was not as laser-focused to that end as its creators might have hoped. Instead, it cut the legs out from under a large portion of the population, black and white, who could now not afford to exercise their right to vote. As a result, the number of people voting for mayor and other city officers dropped to about half of what it had been in 1900. The other point of note about these elections, and most important to answering our question about the continuation of class struggle in New Orleans, was that it saw for the first time in the city's electoral history a ticket nominated by socialists. William Covington Hall stood for election to the mayorship for the Socialists. While he only received 179 votes, the very fact that Labor now had their own party, distinct from the wealthy-controlled Democrats and Republicans, was a sign that not only would their rumblings not be silenced, but they would only grow louder. But apart from the very faint protests of the Socialists, there was very little noise made around the 1904 elections. The opening of the 20th century saw the complete end of dissent at the top of the party politics in New Orleans. The nominating convention for the Ring Democrats had become a de facto coronation for the next mayor. The party would choose the nominee, and there would be no real opposition to stand against him in the election, guaranteeing that no matter how many people did or did not vote, he would be elected. The man who was crowned in 1904 was Martin Berman, and as we will see next time, his reign would be the longest in the city's history. But that will have to wait for later, so please join me next time for the history of New Orleans.